I've loved art for as long as I can remember, but regardless of the clear artistic talent I presented at a young age, what if I told you there's most certainly a timeline out there in which I gave up the craft before I'd even really started? Well, let me introduce you to Exhibit A, or should I say, you. Mrs. U, my art teacher. I went to a very small K-8 school that only had one art teacher, meaning Mrs. U was my art teacher for 9 years. From kindergarten to 8th grade, this woman terrorized my life and tried her darndest to shatter my dreams. Like seriously, if making children cry were a sport, she would have an Olympic medal, maybe even multiple. And that's real, by the way. If one of us was crying in art class, that was just an average Tuesday. Unless it was me crying, because man, as in, for a woman, I'm a very toxically masculine man. I'm a very hard person to bring to tears. Mrs. U only succeeded once, and I never let it happen again. Mrs. U never liked any of our art. And you want to know what she would do to art she didn't like? Well, the most common thing she would do is erase it and redraw it herself, all the while making it very vocal to you, as a small child, that she thought your art was an ugly piece of garbage. And so were you. And erasing a child's artwork is already an insane thing to do, but it gets worse. Sometimes, when her hands were too sore from punching our egos to pick up an eraser, she would save herself the trouble and just toss it in the recycling, because apparently she cares more about the environment than us having a good childhood. When I was in 2nd grade, I drew a sketch of a pack of wolves scouting through the forest, partially obscured by trees, and I loved it so much. I thought it was the best idea I'd ever had. But Mrs. U took one look at my drawing, marched it straight to the recycling bin, and then proceeded to draw the ugliest thing I have ever seen in my life. She got a brand new piece of paper, and on it she drew one giant wolf, supposedly howling, and told me to just work with that instead. Like, that is nowhere near the original idea I had. It was nowhere near as good as the original idea I had, at least not in my memory. But, you know, I can't exactly compare them because one of them got recycled. Now this is where you're probably thinking, it can't possibly get worse than this. But oh my god, does it get worse. Because sometimes, when Mrs. U wanted you to know that she hated you, she wouldn't just throw your art in the recycling. No. She'd add a couple of extra steps first. What steps, you may ask? Ripping your artwork into shreds. I am not making this up. She would take your art, rip it in half right in front of your face whilst yelling at you being a child, and then a couple of weeks later she'd try and gaslight you into thinking she'd never do such a thing. That's real, by the way. One day in middle school, someone mentioned something like, "Hey, do you remember that time you ripped my art in half?" And she laughed in his face and called him a liar. Mind you, this event had occurred only a couple of weeks prior. Hey, that rhymes. But, yeah, no, totally. She'd never do such a thing. One of my strategies for dealing with Mrs. U was that I would only ever show her my art for approval in the last couple minutes of class. That way, there wouldn't be time for her to say or do anything, and even if she did say something, the next time I came into class I could just feign a goldfish memory and move on anyway. And this worked pretty well. However, it did have one downside in that because I cared about my art, and God forbid a child care about their art. I mean, come on, caring about art in art class? Psh. But anyway, because I cared about my art, it took me a bit longer to make things than it did other people, meaning I was always ever so slightly behind, and Mrs. U was always ever so slightly peeved. Thankfully, there was only so much she could do to punish me for that, but unthankfully, there was stuff she could do to punish me for that. We had this, statue thing in front of our school that had been painted maybe 10 to 20 years before I was in 5th grade, when the story takes place, by the students of the school at the time, and it had gotten to a point where it needed a new paint job. It looked like you after a day to the beach with no sunscreen, if you will. And this was an exciting thing, because it meant that now the whole school would be able to help paint the statue in a new way. And this new paint job would likely be there for another 20 years, and be seen by a new generation of idiots. I mean students. However, when it came the time our class got to paint our portion of the statue, Mrs. U said I couldn't help because I was too far behind. Mind you, I was maybe a day's work apart from everyone else, and painting the statue didn't even take the whole class period. But God forbid, one of the only kids who likes art get to contribute to the art, but you know, at least she had some sort of excuse for herself. But the next year, which is 6th grade if you're keeping up, you know, because 5 plus 1 is 6, the more you know. Anyway, every year we had a school auction in which every grade collectively paints something to guilt rich parents into buying. My son made that. This particular year we were painting a turtle, and each of us got a section of the turtle that was ours to paint, quote unquote, how we wanted. So we all created a pattern on an index card, again for approval, because everything needed her approval. And when it came time for me to show mine to her, she, surprise surprise, hated it. Mind you, she had approved everyone else's, some of which are just polka dots, some of which are just a couple of lines. There are only so many ways you can make a pattern, and for some reason mine wasn't enough for her. How do you even veto a pattern? But alas, that was out of my control, just like common sense and decency was outside of Mrs. Yu's control. So I got to work pretending to tweak my pattern, and she never let me paint on the class auction item. You know, the thing parents pay money for because it was painted by the entire class was not painted on by the entire class. It was painted by the entire class minus me. On the bright side though, that turtle was ugly as hell, so I was actually kind of glad I didn't have to be a part of it. But that's besides the point. The audacity. So those were probably the meanest things Mrs. Yu did, but she did also have this one quirk, and that was yellow-orange. You've all heard of yellow-orange. It's yellow mixed with orange. Mind explode. But I'm guessing you haven't really thought much about the color, and man am I jealous. Because it didn't matter what we painted, what our opinions were, some way, somehow, she would replace all of our hopes and dreams with yellow-orange. Every background, yellow-orange. Every accent color, yellow-orange. I think someone taught her color theory and she thought every color was opposite yellow-orange. Or else, she must have just accidentally bought a lifetime supply of yellow-orange paint, because why else would she be forcing us to use it? It's a hideous color. Now, it is probably important to mention that Mrs. Yu probably isn't even the worst art teacher I've ever had, because I had one in high school who got fired before the year was even over for being homophobic and racist and transphobic, and probably sexist too, even though she was a female. But the only real story I have about her is that she had asthma, and one day she just walked out of the classroom without saying a word, or miming, or really indicating anything to us. Personally, I didn't even notice she left. But then she came back half an hour later and was like, I almost died? And where were you guys? You did nothing. I was just out there, dying in the hallway because of my asthma, and you were just going to let me die? And we were all sitting there like, you have asthma? But anyway, I don't want to end on a negative note, and as you may have noticed, we are in a timeline where I didn't lose my passion for art. I didn't let Mrs. Yu win, and I am here today, although I do now consider yellow-orange to be a sin. So let's contrast some of this negativity, shall we? From 3rd grade to 7th grade, I took art classes outside of school, and it was awesome. I still remember the first time I was in her class, and I finished my sketch, and I showed it to her, expecting to get her approval before moving on, but I didn't get her approval. Instead, she asked me what I thought of my drawing, and if I was happy with it, and if I felt ready to move on. And I did. And so I did. And that melted my brain in the best way possible. Common misconception people have about art, and really everything in life, is that some people are just born good at it, and others aren't. But the truth is, some people just enjoy it more, and thus practice more, and get better. More. That's why it's so important to, get this, be kind to children. I mean, be kind to everyone, but especially kids. The younger you are, the more your brain is just a little sponge. Humans are wired to internalize what others tell them. Thus, what you say to those around you, especially kids, can very easily shape their identity, how they talk to themselves, and ultimately what they end up enjoying and thus being good at. Now, I assume y'all are already good people, and thus don't really need to be told that, but I do challenge you to golden rule that logic back onto yourselves. Are there any hobbies or skills you wrote off in your youth because you thought you were garbage? Maybe give one of them another try. Life should be fun, not stressful. If you focus on controlling what you can control, that being your perspective, then maybe some skill will follow, or maybe not, but at least you'll be having fun. So suck it, miss you. You're retired, and I'm successful, so you can recycle my freaking butt, you piece of